So for this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about attitudes and how we go about changing attitudes. We talked a little bit about cognitive dissonance before and how that affected things, but now we're going to talk about how advertisers can actually use that cognitive dissonance to change our attitude and our behavior, right? Basically, our behavior being, do we buy their products or not? So that's what we're going to address in chapter 7. Okay, as always, here are the learning objectives that we're going to kind of cover throughout the discussion. So let's start off with an example about how attitudes can be changed. And advertising is a really great way to look at that. So a really good example is up until the early 20th century, men bought almost all of the cigarettes sold. So advertisers kind of got together and said, hey, we're missing out on a half of the population, right? We could be increasing our sales quite a bit if we were to target women as well. So we started to see campaigns like, smoking has to do with women's liberation or weight control, so on and so forth. And what happened as a result of this is that rates of women smoking caught up to the rates of men smoking. Um, to the point where today they're pretty much the same or at least very similar. And it's not exactly clear how much is advertising responsible for this or not, but it does seem that they certainly played some role in changing people's attitudes towards smoking. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about in this chapter. To what extent can advertising shape people's attitudes, shape their behaviors, right? What exactly is an attitude? How do we go about changing it? So those are some of the things we'll be addressing. So first, let's just start off in terms of some terminology. What are different kind of attitudes that are out there? What are they based on? And we can sort of talk about definitions in that regard. So in social psychology, when we use the term attitude, what we are referring to is this idea that as people, we don't just sort of observe the world and have no opinion about it, right? We make evaluations of the things that we see all the time, of people, of objects, of ideas, right? And these evaluations that we make are attitudes. So that's sort of, I mean, it seems pretty basic, right? But that's sort of what we're talking about in terms of using this word for social psychology. Now, when we talk about attitudes in social psychology, researchers really look at the idea that that attitudes are made up of three potential components: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. Right? We can have attitudes that are affective, meaning that they're sort of emotional in nature. We can have them that are behavioral, meaning their actual observable behavior, or cognitive, meaning thoughts and belief systems, so on and so forth. So we're gonna go through it in a little bit more detail about each of those and give you some examples of differences between them to sort of help clarify that a little bit. So let's say you're in the market to buy a new car and you're trying to sort of make an evaluation of the various cars on the market and you want to decide which one you want to buy. Well, you're probably going to have an attitude about a car, right? You have to make an evaluation to decide what car you want. So we could look at your affective attitude, right? Perhaps you're really excited about a car. Um, you get kind of emotional at the idea of thinking you're going to get a new car because it's exciting to have something new and sort of flashy, so on and so forth. That would be an affective attitude, right? Behaviorally, let's say you go out and you test drive the car, and you drive the car and then actually buy it, right? Because you've sort of engaged in this behavior, and then that behavior itself affects your feelings or your evaluation of the car. That would be a behavioral attitude. And then a cognitive attitude would be something like a more logical approach, right? Well, this one is affordable or it's fuel efficient or I like the gas mileage that it gets, so on and so forth, right? Basing your evaluation of the car on those sort of cognitive, logical reasons would be a cognitive based attitude. So, where do we get our attitudes from? Sort of what influences them? Interestingly, there is some studies that suggest there is some genetics influencing things, right? So we know, for instance, that identical twins share more similar attitudes than fraternal twins, things like taste in music or things like that. Things like the death penalty. When we compare identical to non-identical twins, we sort of see these these similarities, right? Or more similarities for identical twins. People may have inherited a certain temperament and personality from their parents that make them more predisposed to like certain things or to have certain attitudes, right? So that could be this kind of indirect function of our genes. Now, interestingly, not all attitudes are created equally, right? So all attitudes have effective cognitive and behavioral components to them. However, our sort of overall attitude or our overall feelings about something can really be based more on one type of experience than another. And I think we can look at various things. So going back to that car example, for instance, for some individuals, really, when it comes down to the fuel economy and the price of the car, might really be the thing that ultimately influences their attitude the most. Compared to those other components, right? For another person, it might just be the excitement of having a new car. So it really does depend on the individual quite a bit. So when it comes to cognitively based attitudes, sometimes our attitudes really are based primarily on the relevant facts alone. Um, and that really is kind of the sole guiding force in our attitude. So those examples with the car, how many miles per gallon, so on and so forth. For other things, the attitude can be based kind of more on feelings, right? So an attitude based more on emotion and values than on kind of the object's appraisal of kind of pluses and minuses is called this effectively based attitude. And as a guide to which attitudes are likely to be effectively based, consider topics that kind of etiquette manuals suggest you shouldn't really discuss at a dinner party, right? Politics, sex, religion. People seem to vote more with their hearts than with their minds. So, for example, caring about how they feel about a candidate. Caring more about their beliefs than her specific policies. We see things like this in terms of kind of effectively based issues, right? People sort of going based on emotions more than cognitive and logic. It's actually been estimated that about one third of the electorate knows virtually nothing about specific politicians, but nonetheless still have really strong feelings about politicians, right? So, sort of suggesting that those emotions are really what is guiding people's voting choices more so than policies or things like that. And we can really see this in some when we look at certain issues, feelings about such issues like abortion, the death penalty, premarital sex, these areas are often based more on individuals' values than on cold examination of facts, right? So the function of such attitudes isn't really to paint an accurate picture of the world so much as it is to express and validate one's own basic value system. So a lot of times we kind of see these various things influencing our own attitudes towards other people, right? Um, and we can kind of see various aspects that influence our attitudes. So things like what religious system are you brought up with can often affect people's effectively based attitudes. Sensory reactions, right? If you just like something, right? If something is pleasing to the eye or to the ear or to something tastes good, right? All of that would be a sensory reaction. Another thing is conditioning, and we're going to talk a little bit about more about this in the sense that kind of over time our attitudes can be conditioned. Okay. So, for those of you who have taken Introduction to Psychology or sorry, General Psychology 1 or 2, I'm sure you remember a little bit of the classical conditioning discussion on behaviorism. This idea that kind of rewards and punishments really shape our behavior. And classical conditioning is one such aspect of that. This comes from the work from Pavlov. And his dogs, when they heard a bell, they started to drool because they associated it with food, so on and so forth, right? And classical conditioning works that way with people too, right? It doesn't just have to be a dog and a bell with dog food, but some sort of stimulus elicits an emotional response for us. And it's paired up with some sort of neutral stimulus. And eventually, the neutral stimulus takes on the same emotional properties as that first stimulus. So a really good example of this is advertisements, right? Um, if you look at the advertisement in the middle of the slide there, right? There, it's a advertisement for a particular type of beverage, right? And the picture is supposed to elicit this sort of feeling of relaxation, of being very calm and without stress. And the advertiser's hope is that if you see enough of these pictures like this, that eventually when you think of their beverage, which is not calm or not calm or uncalm, right? It's nothing. It's just a drink. But eventually, if you see that enough, you're going to associate, hey, when I have this particular beverage, it makes me think of relaxing and being able to unwind and things like that. When in reality, it has nothing to do with that. But because eventually you're classically conditioned to associate the product with that particular emotion, eventually you do. Another type of conditioning that affects our attitudes is in the form of operant conditioning. And this is kind of more those rewards and punishments or reinforcers and punishments that affect our attitude, right? And attitudes can take on a positive or a negative affect through either this classical or operant conditioning. And a really good example of this is racism. Racism is an attitude, right? Um, that people hold over a certain race or group of people. And what happens is that people are rewarded for various attitudes, right? Maybe a young child sees other people behaving a certain way or saying certain things about another group of people. So when they act that way, they get rewarded, right? Other people are like, oh, yeah, look, little Johnny's saying that too. Or they know that they're modeling mom or dad's behavior. So that's kind of reinforcing all in of itself because they're acting more like the grown-ups and they know that it's pleasing. And over time, little by little, this gets reinforced slowly, slowly in very kind of subtle ways that ultimately condition the individual to subscribe to these attitudes. So, kind of I sort of went through the racism example in terms of operant conditioning, but that kind of idea of, maybe a young child playing with a member of the opposite race, and then later on their father sort of expressing disapproval, saying, well, we don't play with this kind of kid, right? And it doesn't take very long before the child sort of associates interacting with members of that type of kid, whatever that really means to that father, with disapproval, and ultimately adopts those racist attitudes. Classical conditioning, a good example would be something like, suppose that when you were a child, you experience kind of feelings of pleasure and warmth whenever you visit your grandmother. But her house also happened to smell like mothballs. Eventually, you sort of associate the smell of mothballs with these sort of positive feelings that you experienced as a child, right? So, sort of differences between that classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, effectively based attitudes are sort of those that are not really based in logic, right? They don't really have, you can't really rationalize them either. And they're often linked to these values. So, if you're sort of trying to determine the difference between cognitive and affective, um, those are sort of the main differences that we have. And that's not to say that effectively based values are bad, right? Um, Emotions are kind of not bad or good. They're sort of devoid of value in that way. So just kind of if you're sort of thinking, oh, well, cognitive and affective seem the same because they're both kind of happening internally, that's really the best way to determine if we're talking about a cognitive based attitude or an affectively based attitude. So another type of attitude we have is these behaviorally based attitudes, which is basically this attitude based on observations of how we behave towards various things. So, an example of this, let's say you ask your friend how much she likes to exercise. What is your attitude towards exercising? And she replies, well, I guess I like it. I mean, I'm always going to the gym or heading out for a run or something like that. Um, we would say that she has a behaviorally based attitude. Her attitude isn't based on logic, it's not based on emotions, it's based on observing her own behavior, right? So that is kind of an example of that behaviorally based attitude. And these behaviorally based attitudes might seem kind of weird. What do you mean you don't know? You have to look at your own behavior. But sometimes people don't really know how they feel until they see how they behave. And when they're sort of in an ambiguous situation like that, they can form attitudes based on those observations. Um, we're more likely to do this if, again, if it's kind of ambiguous, we're not really sure, right? Or if we can't find any other explanation for our behavior, right? If you sort of think to yourself like, oh, well, when I exercise, it sort of is painful and I don't really feel like I'm getting a health benefit from it, but I see that I'm still going out for a run every single day, right? Well, I must like it, I guess. I guess that explains my attitude, right? So we're more likely to use these behaviorally based attitudes when we can't really explain our attitude. So, on top of kind of having these various bases for attitudes, right? The emotion versus cognition, so on and so forth. We also have kind of these explicit versus implicit attitudes. And these are basically attitudes that we are consciously aware of. Explicit attitudes, we can easily tell other people, hey, I feel this way about this particular thing. Or implicit attitudes, which are kind of not at the surface level. They're sort of involuntary and they're at this unconscious level. So, for example, we have an individual who's white middle class college student and genuinely believes that all races are equal and really kind of feels very negatively towards racial bias. This is this individual's explicit attitude. This is what they can readily state, right? If they were asked, they can say, "Hey, this is what I feel. This is what I believe." It's his conscious evaluation of other races, and it really affects how he chooses to act, right? He will sign the petition for affirmative action policies. He will, work with various civil rights groups, so on and so forth, right, to kind of affect or to show that explicit attitude. However, perhaps this individual also grew up in a culture where there's a lot of negative stereotypes about various minority groups. And he might not even be aware of the fact that some of these negative stereotypes have impacted him or affected him um, in terms of his attitude, right? So he might not even be aware, but when he's around various minority groups, he might get some negative feelings, right? He might suddenly feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And that might be at an unconscious level. He's not even sure why, he can't quite articulate it. And this is that implicit attitude, right? The one that he's not fully aware of. He can't really kind of articulate it, but it's still there. Now, we have explicit and implicit attitudes about all sorts of things. It's not just about race, right? Students can believe explicitly that they hate math, but actually have a more positive attitude than they really realize. I actually see this a lot when I teach statistics with students. These, oh, I hate math, but then when it gets down to it, they're actually it's not as aversive as they tend to think. Um, Now, how do you measure something like this? How do you measure an implicit attitude if people aren't even aware that they have them? This can be really challenging. Interestingly, some researchers have come up with this thing called an implicit attitudes test, or the IAT. And it's very, very good. It's sort of getting at those implicit attitudes. And I would highly recommend that you go to this website that I have here, this link to the implicit attitudes test from Harvard, and you'll see tons of different types of implicit attitudes tests. And you can you can take the test. It doesn't cost anything, or it just takes a little bit of time, and see if anything sort of comes up. There's things on ageism, sexism, racism, um, all sorts of kind of various things up there. And you might be surprised. You might sort of be surprised at what you find. Maybe you didn't really know something about yourself in terms of that attitude. And we might not always be aware of it, but that attitude can influence how we interact with other people. So making ourselves more aware can be really helpful. So let's get to the idea of when our attitudes actually affect our behavior or predict our behavior, right? Under what conditions can these attitudes predict our behavior? And this is something that advertisers and retailers really do want to know, right? Because they want to be able to change our attitude, not just to change our feelings, but to actually change what we choose to purchase or not, right? Our behavior. So there's some evidence that actually suggests that attitudes actually aren't very good predictors of our behavior. There was a study that was conducted all the way back in 1934 that looked at attitudes about individuals who were Chinese and discrimination. And at the time, it was kind of very accepted that people had this anti-Chinese attitude. And this individual went on a cross-country trip with um, Chinese people. And although prejudice against Chinese was very, very high in the 30s, only about one out of the 251 establishments they went to refused to serve the individuals he was with. However, when that same researcher wrote a letter to each establishment after the trip and said, "Hey, would you serve somebody who was Chinese that came into your place?" 90% of them said they wouldn't, right? So that attitude, this, oh, we're anti Chinese, turned out to not actually affect the behavior of those establishments. Um, Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this, right? It could be that different people responded to the survey than the people that served them. It could be that the people's attitudes changed between when the action took place and when they answered the survey. However, it does seem to suggest that attitudes and behaviors don't always line up. So one of the reasons for this, or one of the things that we know can affect whether or not your attitude will affect your behavior, is how accessible that attitude is, right? Um, Attitude accessibility really talks about kind of how sort of strong the association between an attitude and an evaluation of that object kind of affecting the behavior, how they feel about the behavior. So when our attitude accessibility is high, your attitude, it basically means that your attitude comes to mind whenever you see or think about whatever it is we're talking about, right? Um, when your accessibility is low, your attitude only really comes to mind more slowly. So it kind of follows that a highly accessible attitude will be more likely to predict your behavior because people are more likely to be thinking about their attitude when they are called to act. Now, that's fine when we're talking about kind of spontaneous behavior, but a lot of times our behavior is not spontaneous. In many circumstances, our behavior is planned. Most of us think seriously about where we want to go to college, whether or not we're going to accept a job, or where we spend our vacation. And under these conditions, the accessibility of our attitude is kind of less important because given enough time to sort of think about an issue, people with inaccessible attitudes can even still bring to mind how they feel. And it's only when we have to sort of decide on how to act on the spot when that accessibility matters, right? So oftentimes people's intentions are really good predictors of their behavior, as opposed to kind of that attitude of accessibility. So another thing we have to look at as subjective norms, basically people's belief in how people care or how much people care about whatever behavior is in question, right? Um, and also how much control they really feel like they have over that particular behavior. So intentions tend to be influenced kind of by the ease with which they believe they can perform the behavior as well. So, sort of all three of these things really kind of ultimately affect our behavior, right? Our attitude towards the behavior in question, right? The subjective norms. How much do you think other people are going to care about your behavior? And then finally, your kind of perceived behavioral control. Kind of asking people if they have any intention to engage in a particular behavior is usually a pretty good indicator of whether or not they're going to engage in the behavior. Um, so again, this isn't when it comes to sort of spontaneous behaviors, but sort of more thoughtful behaviors or actions that we carry out. So, how do we change attitudes? How do these kind of internal and external factors lead to changes in our attitude and hopefully changes in our behavior? Or maybe not hopefully, sort of depending on what the behavior in question is. So the good news is, I suppose, is that attitudes can change, right? And oftentimes it's due to things like social influence. This is basically why social psychologists are interested in it, this social influence aspect. Attitudes are, in fact, a social phenomenon. So a really good example of this is the popularity of the president often seems to kind of rise and fall with surprising speed. In the weeks before the tragic events of September 11th, for example, only about 50% of Americans said that they approved of the job that George Bush was doing. In the days right after, his approval rating jumped to about 86%. But after that, his approval rating went up and down again. Um, right before the invasion of Iraq in March, his approval rating dropped to 57%, and a month later it rose to 71%. However, sort of overall, if we look, we kind of see similar kind of averages across time. And we can see very similar things with President Obama as well. The approval rating of President Obama has sort of gone up and down since the presidency as well. And sort of changes back and forth. However, we do see some other attitudes that have changed sort of more permanently. If we kind of look back 10 years or 20 years or so on and so forth, nationwide, attitudes towards things like gay marriage have been rather unfavorable, but sort of because attitudes are such a social phenomenon and there is sort of this societal component that goes along with that, attitudes have been steadily becoming more and more favorable throughout time. And since laws have been put into place to reduce restrictions on gay marriage, we've actually seen approval ratings increasing quite a bit towards people's attitudes towards gay marriage as well. So one way that we can go about changing people's attitudes is actually by changing their behavior first. So as we talked about in the last chapter, people can experience dissonance when their image is threatened or when they can't really explain the behavior with external justification, right? If I am behaving in a particular way that doesn't line up with my attitude, then I might have to change my attitude or have to change my behavior, right? So oftentimes what we see is when we can't really explain our behavior with external justification, it sort of leads us to an internal justification for that behavior or an attitude change, right? So we can kind of see how that cognitive dissonance can sort of work to change our attitudes. So it turns out that some ways we can also change attitudes is through persuasion, right? Persuasively communicating with other people, whether it be speech, a television ad, so on and so forth. That actually can change people's attitudes. So how do you actually go about constructing a message that it actually works to change people's attitudes? You can't just say, hey, think different or feel different, right? We have to actually have some sort of reliable way to do this. And some researchers actually came up with something called the Yale Attitude Change Approach. And this is basically a study of the conditions under which people are most likely to change their attitude, right, to various persuasive messages. And it turns out it matters who is saying or who is delivering the message, what sort of message it is, and who the intended audience is. And we're going to go through this in a lot more detail, but sort of just to give you a brief overview of what this Yale Attitudes Change approach is. So, which way is the way that's most likely to persuade us to change our attitude? And this particular approach uses something called the elaboration likelihood model, which basically says that there are two different ways that we can go about changing attitudes. We can use a central route of persuasion or a peripheral route of persuasion. And the central route is used when people are really motivated to have they have the ability to pay attention to arguments um, and the persuasive communication. The peripheral route is used more frequently when people don't really pay attention or they're kind of not as invested in what attitude they're talking about, right? It's kind of more on the surface. So the central route of persuasion really kind of involves when people are really motivated to pay attention to the facts, and they'll be more likely to be persuaded by facts when those are the case, things that are logical and compelling. And this is central route to persuasion, right? If we can kind of use kind of logical arguments, so on and so forth, people are much more likely to pay attention to this if they are in a place where they can actually have the time and the motivation to pay attention to it. The peripheral route of persuasion is where people rely more on kind of feelings or emotional responses to things. Oftentimes, this can be very persuasive, right, in terms of changing people's attitudes. This usually is most persuasive when people aren't particularly motivated to pay attention to the facts. Instead, they sort of notice only the surface level characteristics of a message. How long is it? Who's delivering it? So on and so forth, right? Here, people will not really be swayed by logic of the argument because there's not really paying close attention to the logic. Instead, they're really persuaded by the surface characteristics of the message, right? The fact that it's long or short, it's delivered by an expert or somebody who's really attractive, right? These all make it seem like a reasonable argument. Um, and this is again called the peripheral route to persuasion because people are swayed by these kind of peripheral things rather than the message itself. So, a really good example of this is on cereal boxes, right? On especially kids cereal boxes. There's a lot going on there, right? That looks really fun. It's exciting. There's a cartoon character that looks kind of fun for the kids to sort of engage with. It's very colorful. Um, we're not on there looking at the nutritional value of that cereal. You're not looking at how it actually tastes. None of that is being factored in when the kids are saying, "Oh, I want to get that cereal. I want to try that." Right, it's all just whatever is on the box, that peripheral aspect of it. And mom and dad can say, you know, if I buy this, you have to eat it. And they'll say, yeah, 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 yeah. But then when they get it home, they might not like it as much as they kind of swore they were going to love it in the store because they let that peripheral route influence their decision. Another thing that can affect kind of how which route of persuasion will affect an individual is how motivated they are to pay attention to the argument, right? Let's say, for example, somebody brings up the issue of Social Security and whether or not we should reduce the benefits of Social Security. How personally relevant is that to you? If you're 72 years old, whose sole income is from Social Security, it's probably pretty relevant. However, if you're a 20-year-old from a pretty well-to-do family that is nowhere close to collecting Social Security, the issue probably isn't terribly relevant for you. So you might be less likely to pay attention to it. Um, and you might be more likely to take this sort of peripheral route when it comes to talking about Social Security benefits. But if you're that 72-year-old, you're going to take that central route where you pay very close attention to the details because it's very important to you and you're very motivated. Another thing that can motivate people's willingness to pay attention to the logic of a various argument is people's need for cognition. This is a personality trait that kind of reflects the extent to which people really enjoy engaging in cognitive activities. And those people that are more likely to enjoy engaging in cognitive activities are much more likely to listen to those cognitive arguments, right? They're much more likely to form their attitudes through that central route rather than the peripheral route. So let's say that you want to change somebody's attitude about your product that you're selling, or you think that the people who you want to change their attitude are not going to pay attention that much to the logic of the argument, right? They're going to take that peripheral route. What does that entail? What would people pay attention to? People are much more likely um, to take the peripheral route and to change their thinking. Um, when they feel that the communicator has a higher status symbol, whether that be because they're attractive or they find them very likable. Um, we see people being willing to change that attitude when they're taking that peripheral route, right? So a really good example of this is like, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Wearing that lab coat or kind of saying, you know, I have some sort of medical affiliation, even if it's only as an actor, people are much more likely to listen to that individual as an authority figure. So somebody with a really weak argument can still be really persuasive if they can basically distract their audience enough to say, hey, you know, you can trust this guy. It doesn't matter that they have kind of no logical standing behind their argument. Now, people who base their attitudes on a very careful analysis of the argument are much more likely to keep that attitude once it's changed, right? They're much more likely to sort of maintain the attitude. And they're much more likely to behave consistently with this attitude over time. And they become more resistant to counter persuasion overall. So ultimately, for retailers, it's much more effective to sort of get them to take that central processing route if possible. But if not, then that peripheral route will have to do, right? In terms of kind of permanently changing behavior, the peripheral route's not as effective. But if it's a one-time thing, then they're pretty good at that. Another way to change people's attitudes is to evoke emotion, and specifically the emotion of fear. Persuasive messages that kind of try to get people afraid um, can often be good ways to sort of get to them to change their attitude because they're so focused on that fear that they really don't focus on the logic of various arguments, right? They don't take time to think about it. They just say, well, I want to do whatever it is you say because it might help to bring my fear down. Um, and strong arguments, unfortunately, of fear kind of fail if they become so if they arouse so much fear that they tend to overwhelm people. What happens is people become very defensive, and they can't really think rationally about an issue. And we see this a lot in politicians do this quite a bit, fear mongering with electoral campaigns, things like that. Um, we also see it in things like public service ads, trying to kind of scare people into wearing a seatbelt, into practicing safer sex, staying away from drugs, things like that, sort of playing on those emotions to try to change people's attitudes, as opposed to playing on their logic, right? And that can often kind of be a way to change people's attitudes, as long as it's not done to the point where the fear becomes paralyzing to the viewer. So, do these fear arousing communications actually work? It turns out that they do, but only if the fear is done at kind of a moderate amount or moderate level, right? If we provide too much, then, as I said, it can kind of become paralyzing. And another really important thing that goes along with this is, in addition to evoking the fear, to give information about how to reduce the fear, right? So, for example, cigarette packs sold in Canada are required to display kind of graphic pictures that go along with things like diseased gums, diseased lungs, things like that. So to arouse fear in individuals. But then they also have to have information on where people can go to sort of get help, right? This is a phone number you can call to help you quit, so on and so forth. Do these actually work? Do people kind of tune them out, or do they actually help people kind of pay attention to the argument? And researchers actually looked at this, right? They said, okay, well, what if we showed people um, a film that evokes fear, a film that gives instructions on what to do about it, and then just give them instructions? Which one is going to be the most effective in people's attitudes towards change towards smoking? Um, and it turns out that the biggest reduction in people re- stopping smoking was seen in people who were evoked that fear, but then also given information for how to follow up on it afterwards. Right, giving them a sense of control over things helped quite a bit in terms of actually having an attitude and behavioral change. So, another way we can look at attitude change is the heuristic systematic model of persuasion. And if you recall from chapter 3, heuristics are mental shortcuts that people use to make judgments quickly and efficiently. Within the present context of kind of this discussion, a heuristic is a simple rule people use to basically decide what their attitude is without having to spend a lot of time analyzing every little detail about the matter. So, it kind of reduces some time and gives us this mental shortcut. And emotions are very good at doing that, right? They sort of give us a mental shortcut about things. So let's say that we are trying to decide how we feel about an object, right? Or we're trying to decide what our attitude is about an object. We're going to buy a new couch, right? We go to our furniture store, we look around, we see one within our price range, and we try to decide whether or not we're going to buy it. You sit on it, you test it out, and you basically say, well, how do I feel about this? And you're going to get kind of a emotional response back, like a heuristic, right? You do a quick check of your feelings, your emotions, and if you feel pretty good while you're sitting on the couch, you'll probably buy it, right? If you don't feel good, you probably won't. It's kind of a really quick check in, if you will, kind of using those heuristics. So there's a problem with this though, right? The problem is that sometimes it's difficult to tell where our feelings come from. Is it really that the couch made you feel so great, or is it something completely unrelated, right? Maybe you were in a really good mood to begin with. Maybe you heard your favorite song on the way to the store. So oftentimes what we do is we basically misattribute our feelings, and we're not really aware of sort of where they came from. So we kind of misdirect them somewhere. And it turns out maybe that couch wasn't so great. Maybe it's actually a little lumpier. It doesn't really go with your living room or something like that. But because you felt so good at the time, you assumed it was good about the sofa when it really wasn't the case at all. Um, Now, advertisers and retailers know this. They want to create these good feelings for you while they present this product to you, whether that's by playing music that is very appealing to you or showing you pleasant images and advertisements. Basically, they're hoping that people will attribute at least some of those feelings to the product that they're trying to sell. And that way, they're evoking these emotions as a heuristic. Now, the success of various kind of attitude change techniques really depends on the type of attitude we're trying to change in the first place, right? We talked about having emotional attitudes, cognitive attitudes, behavioral attitudes, so on and so forth. As we saw earlier, not all attitudes are created equally. Some are based on kind of beliefs about the attitude object. Some are based on emotions and values, right? So we have all of these kind of different basis, and how you try to go about changing that attitude really depends on the type of attitude it is. So if an attitude is cognitively based, the best way to try to change it is with rational arguments. But if an attitude is effectively based, it's much more effective to try to change it with emotional appeals. And we see this in terms of kind of the way advertisers uh, advertise things, right? Some ads really stress kind of the merits of a product, the price, the reliability, the efficiency. These are really appealing to those cognitive attitudes, whereas others stress emotions and values, right? This product will make you be sexier, more beautiful, more youthful. All of that is going for those effective attitudes. Now, which kind of ad is the most effective? Again, might be determined by the product or by the individual. So here's one study that was conducted that had participants look at different kinds of advertisements. Some were for some kind of products that everybody needs, things like air conditioners, coffee, kind of very utilitarian products. And people's attitudes towards these kind of products tend to be formed after kind of appraising the product and using a more cognitive approach, right? How energy efficient is it? Things like that. They're cognitively based. Other items were sort of for more social identity products, things like perfumes, greeting cards, things like that. People's attitudes towards these types of products tend to be more effectively based. And then they were shown ads, right? Some of the ads were effectively based, some of them were cognitively based, right? And you can see by the graph here, those cognitively based ads were much more effective than those cognitively based products, and vice versa for effectively, right? So again, it might depend on the product that is being advertised in terms of the most effective way to go about changing people's attitudes. Now, we can actually use some of that behavioral based attitudes to change people's attitude as well, right? We actually know that body posture plays a very significant role in attitude change. We know that cartoons are rated as kind of more funny when holding an object between one teeth compared to when holding it between your lips. So if you hold a pencil between your teeth, it kind of forces the muscles in your face to engage the same way they would as if you were smiling, versus holding it between your lips forces your face to kind of use the same muscles that it would if you were frowning. And people tend to have a much more positive attitude towards viewing various things like cartoons when they're forced into that smile as opposed to when they're forced into that frown. Just like if you're told to sort of nod or shake your head along with listening to somebody else, your attitude will change in kind as well. So just changing your actual behavior can affect your attitude as well. So now let's go into some more research about advertising specifically, how advertising actually works to change people's attitude. And people are actually much more influenced by advertising than they think. Much like that fundamental attribution bias we talked about, oh, other people are influenced, but not me. It turns out people actually are quite influenced by advertising, and they're just not even aware of it. And some of the best evidence that advertising works comes from studies using what are called split cable market tests. Basically, advertisers work in conjunction with cable television companies and grocery stores, showing a target commercial to a randomly selected group of people. They keep track of what people buy and given kind of potential consumers special identification cards that are scanned at the checkout counters. And then they can tell whether or not the people who saw the commercial for, X product actually bought X product. And this can be a really good measure of advertising effectiveness. Um, and it turns out that these tests actually reveal that advertisements are quite effective at changing people's attitudes. And we see this also with public health campaigns, kind of looking at things like substance use or smoking and things like that, and advertisements on the radio can be very effective in changing people's behavior. So, what sort of approach should an advertiser take? Should they take an emotional approach? Should they take a cognitive approach? Well, it depends, right? Let's say that you have a product that it really isn't very different from any other product, right? There's very little difference between brands. Toothpaste, for instance, right? Something like that, you're probably going to have to associate that product with emotion, right? As opposed to if you have something that actually is different, right, or it's personally relevant, then you can take a more cognitively based approach. So, a really good example of this comes from an individual who invented, or I'm sorry, who inherited a company to make surgical antiseptic used to treat throat infections. And that product was known as Listerine. And the individual that inherited, Gerald Lambert, wanted to seek a wider market for his product. So he decided to promote it as a mouthwash instead. The only problem was that no one at the time really used mouthwash or even knew what it was. So having to sell this product, he basically invented a problem, right? He invented a disease. And as a result of that, people started to say, oh, okay, well, I must have this problem. Um, and could kind of play on people's fears for that and actually wound up selling quite a bit of the product, right? Another example of this, so this is the example with Listerine on the left, this, a, quite a sexist example as well, because it's sort of preying on women in particular. Oh, there's this problem that you never knew you had before, and now it's a problem, so you need to do that. But contemporary ads do this too. For a while, Dove was um, going around and talking about how, oh, don't you just hate it when you don't have smooth underarms, and really advertising that this product was going to help make your underarms smoother. Now, before that, nobody cared one way or the other whether or not their underarms were smooth. That was completely irrelevant. Nobody gave a second thought to their underarm. But all of a sudden, now people are self-conscious about this. Maybe I do need this product. Maybe I do need something to kind of moisturize my underarm. Whereas before it wasn't really an issue. And that's a really good example of advertisements working to change people's attitudes. First, they kind of invoke that fear, that concern, and then they do something to change it. Now, another thing that often comes up too when you're talking about psychology or advertisement specifically is the idea of subliminal advertising, right? Is this a form of mind control? Now, when we talk about subliminal advertising, we're really talking about kind of words or pictures that aren't really consciously perceived. They're kind of um, flashed so quickly that people aren't even aware that they're happening, right? And these are supposedly supposed to influence people's behaviors in some way. Now, research shows that there's actually no evidence that subliminal advertising works. Um, they don't cause people to line up and buy more popcorn any more than we normally do. And subliminal commands on self-help tapes to kind of get you to stop smoking or to start, start losing weight or anything like that, they don't work either, unfortunately. So despite this idea that subliminal messages could really kind of help, they really don't do much at all. So one of the problems with advertising is that oftentimes it can promote various stereotypes within a culture, and can kind of make them more widespread. Um, Sometimes they're very subtle, but linking kind of products with various desired images. So, kind of, we see this quite a bit with gender. We see it with race. We see a lot of issues with this, and it can really bias society overall as a whole. And I think sometimes, most of the time, this can be negative, but sometimes it can actually be positive, right? We can kind of see more positives coming as a result of this. So a really good example of this is In 2013, Cheerios ran one of the very first ads featuring an interracial family. Now, that's horrible to say that this only took place in 2013, that this was revolutionary at the time, a whole 3 years ago, right? Um, but that can kind of, being exposed to things like that can kind of slowly help to change people's attitudes as well. Now, unfortunately, one of the stereotypes that we see most often in advertising is gender stereotypes. They are particularly persuasive in advertising imagery. And we see this a lot, kind of women being depicted as being very dependent, right? And one study found that women were much more likely to be portrayed as independent roles or submissive roles in some way compared to men in every single country that it was examined. So this is not limited just to the Western cultures, it's kind of worldwide phenomenon. We also see it in some advertisements, kind of when we look at parenting, right? Dad is always the goofy one that doesn't know how to run his own family or how to work anything without mom around, right? That's also a stereotype that's being kind of portrayed through advertisements when in reality the majority of fathers by and large are just fathers. They don't need mom around to tell them how to do it. It kind of portrays this sort of negative gender role belief about how men and women should or shouldn't behave. Now, if you're interested in kind of seeing more or just kind of how extreme this is, there's a link there, and I also have it in the Blackboard site for gender roles in advertising. And it's just a video that some women did where they switched men and women in some of the gender roles. And you might think like, oh, it's really, that's silly to say that it's quite as pervasive as it is. But I think when you see men portrayed in the same way women are, and it just seems silly, it just seems weird. And when you realize like, well, why should it be weird? Is when you realize just how pervasive some of these gender roles are. We also just see this in the way that body types are portrayed as well in advertisements. So, for females, we're much more likely to see this kind of unrealistic thinness, much more likely to sort of see these unattainable body standards. And this often is more likely to result in real women's attitudes of their own body being dissatisfied, more likely to result in eating disorders. We actually know from research that there's links between the amount of media consumed and the amount of the degree of kind of low body image that they have. Now, that being said, men are more and more being portrayed as kind of also having this unattainable image in the media. And we're seeing an increase in men's same kind of body satisfaction as a result of this increase in the media portrayal as well. And this graph just sort of shows you some differences in terms of portrayals of women and men in television advertising, specifically in when the individual in the advertisement is placed in a dependent role. So the blue bars being when a woman is placed in a dependent role, and when a man is placed in a dependent role is the green or orangey bars, kind of, I'm sorry, the red or orangey bars, depending on sort of your computer monitor. Um, and you can see worldwide, we see this difference that women are much more likely to be portrayed as being dependent and powerless. Now, culture also plays a part in our advertising as well, not surprisingly, right? We have to kind of advertise to the audience we're trying to get to buy our products, right? So, in Western cultures, ads tend to stress this independence a lot more, right? Kind of this will make you be a better individual or stand out more. Whereas Eastern cultures tend to stress this interdependence, right? This will make you more vital to the group or more helpful to the group. And we can actually see this through various research studies that sort of created different ads for the same exact product that stressed either independence or interdependence, and showed those ads to both Americans as well as Koreans. And the Americans rated those ads that stressed independence much more favorably and persuasive than the interdependence. And the opposite was true for the Koreans that were looking at the ads. Now, the research also analyzed actual magazine advertisements in the United States and Korea, and they found that the ads were in fact very different from one another. American ads tended to emphasize individuality, self improvement, and benefits of the product to the individual, whereas Korean ads tended to emphasize the family, concerns about others, and benefits for one's social group. So, in general, um, advertisements tend to kind of work best if they are tailored to the kind of attitude they're trying to change, right? Now, as always, when we talk about culture, this isn't kind of all encompassing. There are exceptions and things like that, but we do see if we look for patterns over time, this tends to be what emerges. So, finally, how can we resist some of these very persuasive things that are trying to change our attitudes? Sometimes we might want to let them, sometimes we don't. What do we do about it? One thing we can do is something called attitude inoculation. Basically, people become immune to attempts to change their attitude by kind of initially exposing them to really small doses of the argument against their position. So consider small doses of an argument against their position. People become kind of immune later to these full blown attempts to change their attitudes. Having considered the argument beforehand, people are relatively immune to the effects of later communication. Just as exposing people to small amounts of a virus can kind of inoculate them against exposure to a full blown viral disease later. In contrast, people who haven't really thought much about the issue, that is, if they form their attitude based on peripheral roots, they're particularly susceptible to an attack on that attitude using kind of logical appeals later on down the line. Another way that advertisers try to change our attitude is something called product placement. Basically, um, without kind of using a commercial per se, but various television shows, whatnot, and just having the products that they're trying to advertise being used by the people in those shows, right? They basically pay the makers of TV shows to incorporate their products into the script somehow, with the hopes of sort of the consumer saying, "Oh, well, I noticed so and so is drinking Coke a lot. Like, oh, I'm going to give it a try too, right? Or oh, I've seen it on that show, and I'm going to do it too." Now, um, that can actually be pretty effective in changing people's attitudes. However, when people are forewarned about other people, about advertisers doing this, they tend to analyze what they see or what they hear much more carefully, and they're more likely to avoid that attitude change, right? If they're basically being told, "Hey, you were being sold this product or being advertised this product without even realizing it," then they're much more likely to say like, "Oh, wait a second, that was kind of a trick, wasn't it?" But without such warnings, people pay very little attention to the persuasive attempts to sort of tend them to get them to buy different things. And we see this a lot with kids, right? Before there's a lot of kind of product placement taking place in kids shows, in kids advertisements, in kids movies. So it's really important as parents that you kind of talk to your kids before they watch TV or before they go to the movies, and talk to them about this idea of product placement, to remind them that they're really likely to encounter kind of several attempts to sort of change their attitude and to try to get them to want particular things, but it's really a trick. It's not really because the characters in that show or that movie really love the product. It's because the people selling the product want you to buy it. And that can actually help kids resist it a little bit as well. Another thing that we have is something called the reactance theory, which is basically if people feel that their freedom is sort of impinged on in some way, they're much more likely to kind of engage in that behavior just to sort of show that they can, right? So in one study, researchers placed one of two signs in bathrooms on a college campus. Um, in an attempt to get people to stop writing graffiti on the restroom walls, one sign read, "Do not write on these walls under any circumstances." And the other sign gave kind of a much more mild prohibition. Please don't write on these walls. That's it. Just please don't do it. The researchers returned 2 weeks later and observed how much graffiti had been written since they posted the signs. And as they predicted, significantly more people wrote graffiti in the bathrooms with the "Do not do this" sign than in the "Please don't do this" room. Similarly, people who receive kind of strong sort of messages against smoking or taking drugs or getting their nose pierced or something like that become much more likely to engage in those behaviors just to prove that they can, right? To show their sort of personal freedom of choice. Even you can think about yourself, if you were walking along and you see a sign that says "Do not walk on grass" versus "Please don't walk on the grass," you're much more likely to walk on the grass on the sign that says "Don't walk on the grass," right? So that kind of reaction can actually make us sort of engage in the behavior more frequently as opposed to less frequently, right? Sort of changing our attitude in that way. We're going to double down on our attitude because nobody can tell us it can change, right? Sort of take on things.